Have you ever wondered why heroes across vastly different cultures seem to follow eerily similar paths? Whether it's Luke Skywalker leaving his farm on Tatooine, Harry Potter receiving his Hogwarts letter, or Odysseus embarking on his epic journey home, these heroes, separated by time, space, and imagination, somehow walk parallel roads. This isn't just a coincidence. In fact, we're about to embark on a fascinating journey into one of literature's most profound mysteries: the power of archetypes. These are the fundamental character patterns that seem hardwired into our collective storytelling DNA. First identified by psychologist Carl Jung in the early 20th century, Jung proposed something remarkable: that certain character types and story patterns are universal, appearing across cultures that had no contact with each other. Recent research has revealed some surprising data about these archetypal patterns. For instance, according to analysis of best-selling novels from 2020 to 2024, less than 5% of contemporary bestsellers follow traditional hero's journey structures. Yet somehow, these archetypal patterns continue to resonate deeply with readers, just in increasingly complex and nuanced ways. This raises some intriguing questions. Are archetypes truly universal, or are they simply convenient patterns we've imposed on stories? How have these patterns evolved in our modern, interconnected world? And perhaps most importantly, what can the way we use archetypes tell us about ourselves and our changing society? Today, we're going to put archetypal analysis to the test, examining how these ancient patterns have adapted to our modern storytelling landscape. We'll look at everything from traditional myths to contemporary television, from oral storytelling traditions to digital narratives. Think of it as a stress test for Jung's theory, pushing it to its limits to see where it holds up and where it breaks down. What we'll discover might surprise you. For instance, while the basic patterns remain consistent, the way different cultures interpret these archetypes can vary dramatically. A study of Native American mythology found that at least 80% of trickster figures share common characteristics across different tribes. Yet each tribe imbues these figures with unique cultural significance. But perhaps most fascinating is how these patterns are evolving in our digital age. Since 2010, digital storytelling platforms have given rise to entirely new archetypal patterns, blending traditional elements with modern sensibilities in ways Jung could never have imagined. So join me as we unravel this literary mystery, examining how these fundamental patterns of storytelling continue to shape our narratives, even as they themselves are reshaped by our changing world. Because understanding archetypes isn't just about analyzing literature. It's about understanding how we, as humans, make sense of our experiences through the stories we tell. Let's start with something seemingly straightforward: the hero archetype. At first glance, it appears to be one of our most stable and recognizable patterns. Look at Beowulf, charging fearlessly into battle against monsters, or Superman soaring through the skies of Metropolis. These are our archetypal heroes in their purest form: brave, noble, self-sacrificing figures who rise to face overwhelming challenges. The traditional hero archetype follows a remarkably consistent pattern. They typically embody virtues like courage, selflessness, and determination. They face external challenges that test these qualities, and through their trials, they grow and transform. But here's where things get interesting. Recent analysis of best-selling novels from 2020 to 2024 reveals something surprising. Less than 5% of contemporary bestsellers feature a clear hero archetype that follows this traditional pattern. Take Batman, for instance. While he exhibits many classical heroic traits, courage, dedication to justice, self-sacrifice, he also operates in moral gray areas that would make Superman uncomfortable. He's violent, obsessive, and sometimes crosses ethical lines in pursuit of his goals. Or consider Hamlet, who's been captivating audiences for centuries. He's noble and ultimately sacrifices himself for justice, fitting the hero pattern. Yet he's also indecisive, potentially mad, and responsible for several deaths through his actions and inactions. This evolution becomes even more pronounced in contemporary literature. Modern protagonists often blend multiple archetypal patterns, creating more nuanced and realistic characters. For instance, contemporary fantasy series typically feature 8 to 12 distinct archetypal patterns in their protagonists, compared to the 5-7 found in classical epic narratives. What's particularly fascinating is how this complexity varies across cultures. Cross-cultural studies show that while the basic hero pattern remains recognizable, its interpretation can vary significantly based on cultural context. The digital age has further transformed how we understand heroes. Digital storytelling platforms since 2010 have given rise to new archetypal patterns that blend traditional heroic elements with modern sensibilities. So does the hero archetype still hold up? Yes, but not in its original, rigid form. Instead, it has evolved into something more fluid and adaptable. The core elements, courage, sacrifice, growth through challenge, remain, but they're now part of a more complex tapestry of character traits and motivations. This evolution raises an important question. Are we seeing the death of the traditional hero, or its rebirth in a more sophisticated form? The answer might lie in how these archetypal patterns continue to resonate with audiences while adapting to our changing understanding of human nature. This fascinating figure appears across world mythology with such consistency that it challenges our understanding of how stories evolve and spread. From Norse mythology's Loki to Native American folklore's coyote, tricksters share an uncanny set of common traits. Despite emerging from cultures that never contacted each other, research shows that at least 80% of trickster figures across Native American mythology share core characteristics: cunning, shape-shifting abilities, boundary crossing, and a tendency to teach through negative examples. These same patterns appear in tricksters worldwide, suggesting something fundamental about how humans process and represent certain aspects of experience through storytelling. Analysis of trickster figures in world literature reveals 7 consistent traits that appear with remarkable frequency: cunning and deception, 80%, mischief and chaos, 70%, selfishness and impulsiveness, 60%, anti-authoritarian behavior, 50%, playfulness and humor, 50%, untrustworthiness, 40%, and adaptability and resourcefulness, 30%. Take Odysseus, for instance. Is he a hero or a trickster? He exhibits classical heroic traits: courage, leadership, determination, but he's also famous for his cunning and deception, most notably in the Trojan horse strategy. He shapeshifts socially, appearing as a beggar when it suits his needs. He's both the noble king of Ithaca and the man who proudly calls himself nobody to outwit a Cyclops. Consider Captain Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean. He embodies classic trickster traits. He's cunning, chaotic, and anti-authoritarian, but he also occasionally displays heroic qualities, saving others at personal cost. Then there's Deadpool, who takes the trickster archetype into meta territory. He not only embodies traditional trickster traits, but actively comments on them. He breaks the fourth wall to acknowledge storytelling conventions, essentially becoming a trickster who tricks the very medium he exists within. According to recent analysis of successful television series, 2015 to 2024, characters who subvert traditional archetypal patterns, like Deadpool, have become increasingly prevalent. Digital storytelling platforms since 2010 have accelerated this transformation, enabling new forms of trickster characters that play with narrative conventions in ways previously impossible. A trickster in an interactive narrative can literally change the story's rules, adding a new dimension to this ancient archetype. The trickster's evolution also reflects broader cultural shifts. In classical narratives, tricksters often served as cautionary tales or comic relief, but in contemporary storytelling, they frequently become protagonists, suggesting a modern appreciation for moral complexity and unconventional approaches to problems. This shift is particularly evident in how these characters are received across different cultural contexts. What one culture sees as admirable cleverness, another might view as deplorable deception. So, when does a trickster become something else? Perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe the true power of the trickster archetype lies in its inherent resistance to categorization. After all, what better way to embody chaos and transformation than to constantly evolve beyond our attempts to define it? This fluidity might explain why trickster figures remain so compelling in modern storytelling. In an era of increasing complexity and moral ambiguity, the trickster's ability to navigate between categories and challenge established norms resonates more than ever. Consider how this speaks to the larger question of archetypal analysis. Perhaps archetypes aren't rigid categories, but rather dynamic patterns that evolve with our changing understanding of ourselves and our world. The trickster, in its endless adaptability, might be showing us the future of all archetypal patterns, fluid, complex, and constantly transforming. We've seen how even seemingly straightforward archetypes like the hero and trickster can become complex. But what happens when characters actively resist archetypal categorization altogether? Let's push our analysis to its breaking point. by examining how modern storytelling is fundamentally transforming these ancient patterns. Contemporary fantasy series typically feature 8 to 12 distinct archetypal patterns in their protagonists, compared to just 5 to 7 found in classical epic narratives. This isn't just about adding complexity. It's about fundamentally changing how character archetypes function in storytelling. Let's look at Game of Thrones as a case study in archetypal disruption. Tyrion Lannister, for instance, embodies aspects of multiple archetypal patterns: the trickster's wit and cunning, the sage's wisdom, the outcast's alienation, and occasionally even the hero's moral courage. But he's not simply a collection of archetypal traits. These elements combine and conflict in ways that create something entirely new. Or consider Daenerys Targaryen's arc. She begins as a classic maiden-victim archetype, transforms into a hero liberator, then shifts into a mentor, mother figure, before ultimately embodying aspects of the villain/destroyer. This isn't just character development, it's archetypal evolution in real time, challenging our fundamental assumptions about how these patterns work. Recent analysis of successful television series from 2015 to 2024 suggests this trend toward hybrid archetypes isn't just artistic innovation. It's becoming the new normal. Modern audiences increasingly expect characters who defy simple categorization, reflecting our growing understanding of human complexity. Cross-cultural studies show that readers' interpretation of archetypal figures varies significantly based on their cultural background. What one culture reads as heroic sacrifice, another might see as foolish pride. These varying interpretations suggest that archetypes aren't as universal as Jung originally proposed. They're more like flexible frameworks that we adapt to our cultural contexts. The digital age has accelerated this transformation. Digital storytelling platforms since 2010 have enabled new forms of narrative that blend archetypal patterns in previously impossible ways. Interactive narratives, for instance, allow characters to shift archetypal roles based on reader choices, creating dynamic hybrid archetypes that evolve throughout the story. While purely archetypal characters are increasingly rare in contemporary literature, less than 5% of bestsellers from 2020-2024 feature traditional archetypal patterns. The underlying archetypal frameworks haven't disappeared. Instead, they've become more like ingredients in a complex recipe rather than rigid categories. This evolution reflects broader changes in how we understand human nature. Modern psychology recognizes that people rarely fit into neat categories. We're all complex combinations of different traits and tendencies. Contemporary literature, with its hybrid archetypes and fluid characters, simply reflects this deeper understanding. Consider how this affects storytelling across different media. In traditional written narratives, hybrid archetypes might develop over hundreds of pages. In visual media, these complex characters might be expressed through subtle visual cues and symbolic imagery. In interactive media, they might emerge through the accumulation of player choices and consequences. The rise of hybrid archetypes also raises fascinating questions about the future of storytelling. If pure archetypes are becoming less common, what new patterns are emerging to replace them? How do these hybrid characters reflect and shape our understanding of human nature? And perhaps most importantly, what do these changes tell us about how our society's values and perspectives are evolving. The answer might lie in how we're beginning to understand archetypes not as fixed categories, but as dynamic patterns that can combine and evolve. Just as modern physics sees light as both particle and wave, perhaps modern storytelling is learning to see characters as both archetypal and unique, both pattern and exception. This new understanding might actually make archetypes more relevant, not less. In a world of increasing complexity and nuance, these flexible, hybrid archetypes might better reflect how we actually experience and understand human nature. They remind us that the power of storytelling lies not in fitting characters into predetermined boxes, but in exploring the endless possibilities that emerge when we let them break free of those constraints. Let's push our analysis of archetypes even further by examining how they perform across different cultural contexts. While Jung proposed these patterns were universal, emerging from a collective unconscious, the data tells a more complex story. Consider the mentor archetype, which shows fascinating variations between Eastern and Western literary traditions. Over the past century, Western mentors have typically focused on providing practical knowledge and direct guidance. Think Gandalf explicitly directing Frodo's quest, or Dumbledore preparing Harry for his confrontation with Voldemort. In contrast, Eastern mentors often emphasize harmony with nature and inner balance, taking a more subtle approach to guidance. The quantifiable differences are striking. Studies show that Eastern mentors are more likely to focus on the hero's spiritual development and inner growth, while Western mentors tend to emphasize practical skills and knowledge. This isn't just a slight variation. It reflects fundamentally different cultural approaches to wisdom, authority, and personal development. Cross-cultural studies reveal that the same character might be interpreted radically differently depending on the reader's cultural context. What Western readers might see as a wise mentor's tough love, Eastern readers might interpret as unnecessary harshness or a failure of guidance. Take the Trickster Archetype in Native American mythology. Research shows that at least 80% of trickster figures across different tribes share common characteristics like cunning and shape-shifting abilities. However, each tribe imbues these figures with unique cultural significance and moral implications. This cultural variation extends to how archetypal patterns evolve over time. For instance, the mentor archetype in Eastern literature often reflects cultural values such as respect for authority and tradition, while Western mentors increasingly embody values like individualism and self-reliance. Digital storytelling platforms since 2010 have added another layer of complexity by enabling global access to diverse cultural narratives. This cross-pollination of storytelling traditions has led to fascinating hybrid forms. Perhaps most intriguingly, research on reading comprehension shows that students engage differently with traditional versus subverted archetypal characters based on their cultural background. This suggests that while archetypal patterns might be universal in their broadest sense, their specific expressions and interpretations are deeply culturally embedded. Are archetypes truly universal, or are they more like flexible frameworks that each culture adapts to its own needs and values? The evidence suggests both might be true. There are indeed fundamental patterns that appear across cultures, but their expressions and interpretations vary significantly based on cultural context. As our world becomes more interconnected, these cultural variations in archetypal patterns don't disappear. Instead, they create richer, more nuanced narratives that can speak to multiple cultural traditions simultaneously. This isn't a weakening of archetypal patterns, but rather an evolution into more sophisticated forms that can bridge cultural differences while respecting cultural specificity. The implications for storytelling are profound. Rather than trying to force characters into supposedly universal archetypal patterns, modern narratives might be better served by understanding how these patterns flex and adapt across cultural contexts. After all, the true power of archetypes might lie not in their universality, but in their ability to express both our common humanity and our rich cultural diversity. The evolution of archetypal patterns in the digital age presents us with a fascinating paradox. While these ancient character patterns persist, they're transforming in ways that Jung could never have imagined. Let's track how modern storytelling platforms and social media are reshaping these fundamental narrative building blocks. Since 2010, digital storytelling platforms have revolutionized how we create and consume narratives. This isn't just about new delivery methods. It's about fundamental changes in how archetypal patterns function. Interactive storytelling, social media narratives, and transmedia experiences have created environments where archetypes must be more fluid and adaptable than ever before. Consider this striking data point. Less than 5% of best-selling novels from 2020-2024 feature traditional archetypal patterns. Instead, we're seeing the emergence of what might be called digital native archetypes, character patterns that are uniquely suited to our interconnected age. These new patterns often blend multiple traditional archetypes while incorporating distinctly modern elements. For example, the digital sage archetype that's emerging in contemporary narratives combines elements of the traditional mentor figure with characteristics unique to the information age. They're often fallible, crowdsource their wisdom, and acknowledge the limits of their knowledge. Think of Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's brilliant, but flawed, relies on artificial intelligence, and learns from his mistakes in public ways. Social media has particularly influenced how archetypal patterns evolve. The ability to construct and present multiple versions of self has given rise to what some scholars call the curator archetype, characters who actively manage different versions of themselves across various contexts. This pattern would have been almost incomprehensible in pre-digital storytelling, yet it resonates deeply with modern audiences. The data becomes even more interesting when we look at successful television series from 2015 to 2024. Shows featuring protagonists who subvert traditional archetypal patterns have become increasingly prevalent, suggesting that audiences are not only accepting, but actively seeking out these more complex character configurations. But perhaps the most fascinating development is how digital platforms have enabled new forms of collective storytelling. Fan fiction, collaborative narratives, and interactive storytelling have created environments where archetypal patterns can evolve in real time, shaped by community input and interaction. This democratization of storytelling is giving rise to new archetypal patterns that emerge from collective creativity rather than individual authorship. Contemporary fantasy series now typically feature 8 to 12 distinct archetypal patterns in their protagonists, compared to the 5-7 found in classical epic narratives. This increased complexity reflects not just changing storytelling techniques, but our evolving understanding of human nature and identity in the digital age. We're also seeing fascinating variations in how different cultures adapt these new patterns. Cross-cultural studies show that while digital platforms have created some universally recognized new archetypes, their interpretation and expression still vary significantly based on cultural context. A character pattern that emerges from Western social media culture might be reinterpreted in strikingly different ways when adapted for Eastern audiences. So, are new archetypes being created? The answer appears to be yes, but with a crucial caveat. These new patterns aren't replacing traditional archetypes so much as building upon them in increasingly complex ways. They're hybrids that combine ancient patterns with modern sensibilities, creating something both familiar and revolutionary. This evolution raises important questions about the future of storytelling. As artificial intelligence begins to play a larger role in narrative creation, how will these archetypal patterns continue to evolve? Will AI-generated stories create entirely new archetypal patterns that we haven't yet imagined? What's clear is that archetypal patterns aren't disappearing. They're adapting and evolving to meet the needs of modern storytelling. Just as ancient storytellers adapted their archetypes to fit their cultural contexts, we're adapting ours to fit an increasingly digital and interconnected world. The result is a richer, more complex understanding of how these fundamental patterns can help us make sense of our changing world. From ancient myths to modern digital narratives, archetypal patterns continue to shape how we tell stories and understand ourselves. But as we've seen, these patterns aren't rigid templates. They're dynamic frameworks that evolve with our changing world. As you continue to explore stories in your own life, consider these questions. How would you classify a character who exhibits traits of multiple archetypes? Think about your favorite complex characters. Are they breaking archetypal patterns, or revealing new ones we're just beginning to understand? What new archetypal patterns might emerge in the next 50 years of storytelling? As artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other technologies transform how we tell stories, what new character patterns might arise to help us make sense of these changes? Can you identify an archetypal pattern in your favorite story that breaks traditional rules? How does this deviation make the story more compelling or relevant to modern audiences? How might different cultures interpret the same archetypal figure differently? Consider how your own cultural background influences how you understand and relate to different character types. These questions aren't just about analyzing literature. They're about understanding how we use stories to make sense of our increasingly complex world. As our storytelling continues to evolve, perhaps the true power of archetypes lies not in their permanence, but in their ability to adapt and transform while still speaking to something fundamental in the human experience.